Hilchos Metam'ei Mishkav Umoshav Perek Shmini, the laws of those who transmit impurity to the things that they lie on and they sit on, chapter 8. Today is an interesting chapter in the context of these laws, because it's not about Mishkav Umoshav. It's not about the things that you lie on and the things that you sit on. The whole context of these halachas is that you have four people, Zav, Zava, Nida, and Yeledes, who become impure so much so that the things that they lie on and they sit on and they ride on, as long as those things are meant to be lied upon or sat upon or ridden upon, as we saw yesterday, those things will actually become impure to the same level, Av Hatuma, a father, a primary source of impurity. Today, the Rambam talks about another law that applies to these people. So it's about Metam'ei Mishkav Umoshav, it's about those people who transmit impurity to the things which they lie on or they sit on, but the subject is not so much about those things upon which they lie or sit, rather the subject is about Hesed. And we had the concept of Hesed before when it came to corpse impurity. It's basically the idea where something is moving because of your influence. You aren't directly carrying it or touching it, but because of your influence, it's being moved. And what we're going to see is that there's a extra level of severity by the Metam'ei Mishkav Umoshav, by these people, when it comes to Hesed. It says the Rambam as follows, Halacha Aleph, Kvar be'arnu b'tchila sefer zeh. We already explained in the beginning of this book, again in the context of corpse impurity, she'im hesit ha'adam es hatuma shehi metama b'masa, that if a person moves, causes to move, a source of impurity, which transmits impurity through carrying, like an olive-sized portion of a corpse, olive-sized portion of an avela, of a dead animal carcass, nitma mishum naiseh, the Hesed goes under the umbrella of masa. Masa is a type of contracting impurity through carrying. As long as this object transmits impurity through carrying, if you did Hesed, if you caused it to move, it's also considered to be like carrying. Avalim hesita hatuma esa adam. But if somehow a source of impurity would cause a person to move, loy nitma, he wouldn't become impure. For example, just using the seesaw as an example. If there's a corpse on one side of the seesaw, comes a guy and pushes down the seesaw so he causes the corpse to move, that's Hesed, he becomes impure. But let's say a person is sitting on the seesaw and somebody drops a piece of corpse on the other side of the seesaw, so the seesaw to the corpse causes the person to move, Heisita hatuma esa adam, it doesn't transmit to the person. With the exception of these people. Halacha beis ein b'chol avos hatumos kulan. Amongst all the primary source of impurities, you don't have any tuma. You don't have any source of impurity. She'im tasit es ha'adam ha'toher, or yesakli ha'toher tetamei yaisan. That if it causes a pure person or a pure utensil to move, that it will make them impure. Ela hazav echaveirav bilvad. With the exception of the people we're discussing here in these laws, the Zav and his friends, the Zava, Nida, and Yeledes. If they cause somebody else to move, that person becomes impure. This is the additional type of impurity we find by Azav and all his friends that we don't find anywhere else in the Torah. That if he or any of the four causes a person to move, they become impure. The Mishkav Umoshav, the first 7 chapters of these laws, which is also an additional tumah that applies to the Zav and his friends, there's another person that has that, the Mitzayra, as we've actually mentioned in these set of laws itself. The only thing which is unique to these 4 is the concept of Hesed, that if they cause a pure thing or a pure person to move, that thing or person becomes impure. What's an example of this? Ketzad. What does this look like? Let's say you have a beam that's lying across the top of a fence. And on one edge is a person who's pure, or utensils, even if it's pottery utensils, which has a rare law that Tumah has to enter their airspace. Comes a Zav and moves the other edge of the beam, thereby causing the things on the other edge to move. Seesaw is just a nice example to see it in the live, but you can imagine the same thing as the Rambam's case. It's a beam lying across a fence, and you move one side, causing the things to move. Since the person or the kalim on the other edge moved because of the Zav, it's as if he touched them and they're impure, and they become first degree impurity by biblical law. So in this way they're less severe than Mishkav Umoshav. Mishkav Umoshav, if a Zav lies or sits on something, that thing itself becomes an Avatuma, a primary source of impurity. Hesed only causes the thing that's being moved to become Rishon Latuma. Needless to say, that if the Zav would actually carry the person or the utensils, even without touching them, In other words, it would be like there would be some intervening utensils there, or a rock, or whatever it is. Point is, they're being carried because of the zav, shatiman, that he makes them impure. The echad zav, v'zava, nida, v'yoldes, b'chal advarim ha'elu, the Rambam repeats, when we say zav, we mean all four of the category, the zav, the zava, the nida, and the yoldes. Hine lamadata, so from this you learn, sheha'adam ha'tohir sheheset es hazav, if you would have a pure person who causes a zav to move, if it would be the opposite scenario, here's the zav causing the people to move. If it's the people cause the zav to move, nitma mishum neisei zav, he becomes impure on account of carrying a zav, which is a type of impurity anyways. But if a zav causes a pure person to move, ben adam ben kelim, whether it's a person or utensils, afilu klicheres, even if it's pottery utensils, which again is a novelty because the tumah usually only enters through the airspace. But here, because he moves them, so it's as if the impurity entered their airspace. Tmei, and they're all becoming impure. Because when a zav shakes or causes other things to move, it's as if he touched them. Halacha gimel chaymer beheset hazav mimagoy. Even though we just said that heset for a zav is like he touched them, but in fact there's a stringency when he does heset to other things over and above if he would straight up touch them. And what is that? That if he were to touch a pottery utensil which is surrounded by a tight covering, tahar, it would be pure, like we had by the case of the corpse impurity. Tumah cannot penetrate if it's covered, if it's sealed tightly. However, if he causes it to move, like in the seesaw or the edge of the beam, he would make it impure. Even things that are inside it, the tight covering doesn't save it. Same thing if you have a pottery utensil which is hollow, like a ball, and the opening was never made. Like the Iranian, that's what it sounds like, the Iranian ilpasin. Ilpasin were going to essentially become a type of bowl or a pan, but they would actually manufacture them by making a ball shape. You take two half spheres, you would attach them, make them into a ball, and later they would fashion the opening. So while they're in the ball state, they're completely closed from all sides. There's no way to get into the airspace. Let's say there was something stuck in there, a utensil stuck in there when you put the two half spheres together. Im hesitan hazav tmeya. If a zav causes them to move, they become impure. Everything inside them becomes impure. Even though if they were in the tent with a corpse, they'd be pure. Because they're like a pottery utensil surrounded by a tight covering whose opening is closed, and therefore the corpse impurity can't get in there. But when it comes to Heset Hazav, it's strict and they become impure. So too, you have a needle swallowed, absorbed inside a wooden piece, a piece of wood, or a ring that's swallowed or absorbed inside a brick. Comes a zav and moves or causes to move this wood or this brick, the utensils that are absorbed inside them are impure. Even though, again, when it comes to corpse impurity, the impurity won't affect things that are balua. But here they will. And the same applies in all similar situations. By the way, I should note what the commentaries say, that Rambam chooses these cases specifically. Balua in a utensil. If it would be balua in a person or in an animal, then the things that are absorbed inside them, even if they're touched by a zav, doesn't become impure. Halacha dalet. Zav shehichnis yadei raglei la'avir klicheres. You have a pottery utensil, which again only becomes impure through its airspace, and a zav puts just part of himself inside the airspace. He sticks his hand in or he sticks his foot in. And let's say he didn't touch it. He just stuck the hand into the airspace. He didn't touch the walls of the utensil. Didn't move it, nothing. Just put his hand in and out. Says the Rambam, since he didn't touch it, the pottery utensil remains pure, which is very interesting because seemingly it's in the airspace. Tumah is in the airspace. Says the Rambam, she'ein hanida v'chayetzeba mitamin le'evarim. A nida, a woman who is in this category, zav, zava, nida, yeledes, and her friends cannot transmit impurity just by partial limbs. When we say that tumah has to enter the airspace of the utensil, the entirety of the person will have to go inside. Just sticking one limb into the utensil is not considered having tumah go into the airspace. So all the commentaries raise the question, why is this different than touching? If a zav were to touch something, it would become impure. Well, why don't we say, oh, you're only touching with part of you. It's not your whole being touching it. So, discussed at length, and the common consensus is that when you have negia, when you have touching is related or is considered to be done by the entirety of the person. Yes, it's being practically done by your finger, but when you touch something, you say, I touched it. That means the Hebrew is misyacheses ala adam kulai. It's considered to be done, it's an act considered to be done by the entirety of the person, versus when you stick your actual limb into a utensil, then we say either you're all in, and if you're not all in, then it doesn't become impure. Halacha hey zav shahayakane achuz b'seich kumtai. Let's say you have a zav, and there's a stick or a reed that's caught inside a fold of his skin. Kumtai comes from the word kemet, wrinkle or fold. So let's just say the classic case would be putting it under your armpit. So he's walking around with this stick coming out of his armpit. By the way, I learned a new thing in preparing for this class. Golfers, they use this thing. It's called an alignment stick. And they'll many times hold it under their arms. So this is a good example. Imagine he's a zav, and he's carrying this stick, b'seich kumtai, inside a fold of his skin. V'hesit v'hoitzi b'ktsei hakane adam oikli. And with the edge of this rod that's sticking out of his armpit, he causes a person or utensil to move. So interestingly, they're actually pure. The whole idea of hesed is being done by the actual hands of a zav, not by something caught under his arm. Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, anything that a zav will touch, if he didn't wash his hands in water, then Torah continues, becomes impure, you have to wash your clothes, etc. We learn from tradition that even though Torah is using the word touching, it's actually referring to hesed, causing to move indirectly. And the reason Torah says the word yiga, touching, loymar, is to say man negia biyadav v'hadei miliyadav. The same way touching has to be done with a hand, or things that are similar to a hand. Mishar gufay hagaloy, eitzal hanegia, any other body part, but that's open, that's revealed, and therefore able to be creating contact. Af heseitay, so too when he causes something to move, ad sheyasit bagolish begufa. He needs to do that causation with something which is a revealed part of his body. Lo sheyasit bebeis hastarim, not that he causes something to move using an area which is typically concealed, like an armpit. Now, that's all if it was the zav who was carrying this stick. Haya hakane bekumte shel tahar. What if it's a pure person who has this stick, this rod, in his fold of skin? The hasted bayas hazav, and he causes the zav to move with the stick, then tameh. Then he's actually impure. Shahamesit as hatuma ken isa. Because relative to the pure person, his relationship to the impurity is through hesed. And when you contact a source of impurity through hesed, it's like carrying it. When it comes to carrying, doesn't matter if you carry with a revealed part of your body or a covered part of your body, you're impure. As we explained in the beginning of this book, in the laws of corpse impurity, when we defined masa for the first time. So too, when you do hesed with a part of you that is covered, you will become impure if it's through you that you're touching the source of impurity. Halacha vav, an interesting case. Hazav b'kaf meiznayim. We have a scale, and there is a zav on one side of the scale. Don't ask me how big the scale is or why they're doing this, but there's a zav sitting in one side of the scale. Ukliha asui lemishkav lemerkav b'kaf shniya kenegdai. And on the other side, there's a utensil which is meant for lying or sitting or for writing. I put a chair there on the other side of the scale. So here, even though there's no contact between the two, we're going to see in certain cases this chair will become impure. Kara hazav, if the zav ended up being heavier than the chair, so he weighed down the scale. We consider this to be like a utensil which he touched, because he caused them to move by his weight, he caused them to go up, and therefore they are going to become impure. Karuhain, if however they succeeded, the chair was heavier than the zav, and they were the one that outweighed the zav, tmein mishum mishkav. So even though we can't call this hesed, certainly the zav didn't cause them to move, but funny enough, they actually become even more severely affected. They become a mishkav. They become something which the zav is lying on, the nasu of, and they become an avhatuma, a primary source of impurity, shahare nasu hazav uki'ilu amad aleyan, because they're carrying the zav. It's as if he's standing upon them. And what did we learn yesterday? That there's 5 ways that a zav can make a mishkav or a meishav impure. One of them is through standing. And so, in this case, in either scenario, the chair is going to become tamei, either by dint of hesed, in which case it's only a rishon, or, even worse, it's going to become a mishkav. What if in the other side is not a utensil which could become a mishkav or a meishav, but rather other utensils, or food and drink, or a person? So here, bein shekaru hein, bein shekara hazav, doesn't matter what outweighs the other. Whether they outweighed the zav or the zav outweighed them, kulan rishain letuma. They're all going to be considered to be first degree impurity. So if the zav was the one that outweighed the other stuff, that's obvious, because it's just like the other case. When the zav is outweighing them, it means he's causing the other things to move. So there's hesed right there. Hesed creates a rishon. But in the other case, when the other things outweigh the zav, why here are they becoming impure? So the commentaries say a very interesting thing. When they outweigh the zav, it's as if they're being lifted. Pay attention here. It's as if they're being lifted by the zav. How so? Because without the zav, they'd go down even further. Yes, they're outweighing the zav, but if the zav weren't there, they would outweigh it even more. So now, in a way, by the zav being there, he's lifting them from their potential state of lower descent. And therefore, that's considered to be a zav coming into contact with them, and they become impure. Therefore, the commentaries note it has to be a case where they outweighed the zav, not to the point where they fell to the ground. Because if they fell all the way to the ground, then whether the zav is there or not, they wouldn't be able to go lower. It has to be that they outweighed it to a lesser point, not reaching the ground all the way. Halacha Zayin. Hazav v'hatar sheyashvu ala safsal. You have two people sitting on a bench. One is a zav, one is a person who is pure. Oy al haneser, or on a board. But the thing with this board or this bench is bizman shehin machgirin. It's a time when they're wobbly. Happens all the time. You have chairs or benches. Not all four legs are level, and you end up, shaking around on this bench. Point is, the bench is on a good, strong support. Or they climb the tree who has bad support. What kind of tree is bad support? The trunk at the bottom, the thickness of the trunk is not big enough to carve out the area of a reiva hakav. Reiva hakav is a quarter of a kav, it's a volume of measurement. Let's say you had a container which called a reiva hakav, and you wanted to draw the shape of this container out, carve it out from the trunk, you wouldn't be able to do it. That's an ilan shekoichira, bad support. Or maybe the tree was a very firm and beautiful tree at the trunk, but you climbed the tree to the point where you reached a branch that doesn't support well. How do we measure a bad support branch? If you're hiding in the tree and you would push the branch would move. You have thick branches sometimes that even when you're climbing a tree and you push the branch, it doesn't move. This is a branch that would move if you pushed it. That's how one commentary explains this line here. Kesef Mishnah actually says, nechbaba doesn't mean you're hiding in the tree, it means you only have the branch. Imagine you would only have this branch and you tried folding it in your hand, it would move. It would move your hand. I think that's the pshat in the Kesef Mishnah. But the better, or the more simple commentary seems to be the first way that I said. You're hiding in the tree and you move the branch, it would move. It would cave to your pressure, essentially. It couldn't hold you up. Or they both ascended a Egyptian ladder. An Egyptian ladder means, like what we call today a step stool, doesn't have 4 rungs, and it's therefore small. But it's not attached to the wall with a nail. It's just a loose step stool. Or they ascended a wooden ramp, or a wooden plank, or a wooden door that's being used as a ramp, and they're not attached firmly with clay or mud. In all these cases of weak support, hareza tameh, the pure person who's sitting together or standing together with the zav becomes impure. Because automatically they're going to be shaking. And it's considered as if the zav caused the person to move. But if they're sitting on a big boat that doesn't shake just because somebody else steps into it, or they're sitting on a board or on a bench, but they're not wobbly, or they climb the tree or a branch that has good support, or an Egyptian step stool, which is attached to the wall with a nail, or on a ramp or a plank or a door that are attached firmly with clay or mud, even if they ascended from the same side, they're always pure. Because since there is very firm support, you can't consider it that the zav is causing the person to move. They're functioning each on their own independently. Halacha ches, similar cases. Zav v'toher shahayu shneim ke'echad megifin es hadeles ay poischin. You have a zav and a pure person that are together trying to shut a door or open a door. Harei ze toher, they are pure. One doesn't move from the other. Haya echad megif ve'echad peseach. But if one is pushing to close and one is pulling to open, nitma, he becomes impure, because definitely through the struggle, when, let's say, the zav is pulling or pushing, the other person will be pulled or pushed after him. And there will be a causation of a zav causing the person to move. Helu zeh zeh min haboyer. If one of them is lifting another one out of a pit, im hatame helo as hatoher. If it's the impure person that's lifting the pure person, so of course he makes them impure, he caused them to move. But if it's the pure person who lifted the impure person from the pit, nitma b'masoi kamesha b'yarnu. He becomes impure because he carried him, as we explained. Now, the commentaries deal with the fact that either way, it's still a risha in the tuma. Whether it's hesed or masa, it's all first degree impurity. So why is the Rambam making two cases out of it? So one commentary that I saw, the Mishnah Lamelech writes that in the case of the toher lifting up the tamei, if the toher person is still in contact with the tamei, not only does the masa make it rishon, but also an av. As long as what's called loy perish mi metam'ei, we had in chapter 6, you don't separate. You didn't disconnect from the source of impurity, you actually become an av hatuma. And therefore it's two different categories. One would be rishon, one would be av. But that's only the Mishnah Lamelech. Other commentaries just say simply, in both cases it's a rishon, just for different reasons. One for hesed, one for masa. Halacha tes, zav v'tar shari mafshilin b'chavalim. If a zav and a pure person are weaving rope, they're netting rope. Im haya zeh moishech elach v'zeh moishech elach. If one is pulling this way, one's pulling that way, nitma. So again, the struggle will cause, for sure, one to cause the other to move, and therefore the person becomes impure. Hayu ergin, if they were weaving together, bein ba'imdin, bein b'yoshim, whether they're standing or sitting. Oy toichanin, or they're grinding together. Oy perkin min achamoir, oy toyanin, they're unloading or loading a donkey. Bisman shamasan kaved, if what they're holding together is a very heavy weight, harezeh tameh, they're for sure impure. The pure person is for sure impure, because he's going to be affected or wobbled or shooken around by the influence of the zav. But if it's a lightweight, it's pure, because there's no way the zav influenced the person. Halacha yud tahor shahaya makeh es hazav. A person who is pure is hitting a zav, a person who is impure, whether by hand or by a stick. Harezeh tahor. He remains pure. Both him and his clothing, he remains pure. V'zav shehika es hatahor tim'ahu. But if it was the tamei person hitting the pure person, he actually makes him tamei. For an interesting reason, says the Rambam. She'im yimashech hatahor v'harei hatamei noifel. Someone's giving a punch, and the guy doesn't stay there. He moves back, and the person's forceful punch might actually force him to fall over. So if the tahor moves back, the zav will fall. By the fact that his hit is landing where he wants it to land, it's as if he's leaning on the person. When you lean on the person, he becomes impure. Now, the truth is, the person himself doesn't become impure, because a person cannot become a Mishkav of a zav. Rather, it goes through the clothing. The clothing of the pure person become impure, and by dint of the clothing becoming impure, the person becomes impure. So the commentaries ask the question, wait, this thing should be the opposite way. When a tahor is hitting a tamei, say the same thing. If the tamei moves away, the tahor's punch won't land, he'll fall over. So in a way, he should be considered to be leaning on him. And there's a lot of discussion on this. I'll leave it to the students. If you have any commentaries that you find on this, please let me know in the comments online. Halacha Yud Aleph, Zav Shenisa, Miktsasei al HaTahor, Oy Tahor Shenisa, Miktsasei al HaZav. What if a Zav only was partially carried or landed on top of a pure person, or only part of a pure person landed on a Zav? Nitma, in both scenarios, the person who is pure becomes impure. When the Zav goes partially over the Tahor, he's carrying the Zav. When the Tahor goes partially over the Zav, he's what's called Madaf. We had earlier in these laws. If you're on top of a Zav, you become Tameh. What does this mean? Ketzad, what's an example of this? Etzboi shel Zav shehinicha l'mayla min atar. Let's say a Zav takes just his finger and puts it on top of a pure person. So part of him is being carried, so to speak, by the Zav. Or a pure person puts his finger on top of a Zav. Even if it's not directly on top. There's a stone in between them or a beam in between them. The person who is pure becomes impure. By the way, this is in contrast to the Mishkav or Umoshav. We had the other day that if a tamei only goes partially onto a Mishkav, that Mishkav doesn't become impure. Or if you have an impure Mishkav and a pure person goes partially onto the Mishkav, he doesn't become impure. But when it's two people, the Tumah transmits even through a partial carrying. V'chein chiburei hazav. So too with units or entities that are attached to a zav. The Rambam will immediately define this. Shenisu ala Torah, that were carried over onto a pure person. Or chiburei Torah shenisu ala zav, or things that were attached to a pure person, that were carried by or on top of a zav. Harei tamei, the pure person or the pure attached entities become impure. It's as if the friend, the impure, had actually carried the person, not just the attached entities. What's called attached entities? Teeth, nails, and hair, they're attached to the body. They aren't the body itself. A person has long hair. He puts his hair over a tahor person. The tahor person becomes impure, just like were it to be the zav itself. It seems to me, says the Rambam, that this impurity is only rabbinic. Which is this impurity? The commentaries debate. It for sure refers to the chiburei hazav that we just mentioned. Some say it even refers to the beginning. The etzboi shel zav is also only a rabbinic enactment.